All right, welcome everybody. We'll take a few minutes as people join the Zoom session. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm excited about today's panel. Slight change of personnel here as we wait on a couple of folks to join us, maybe due to the major flooding that we had over the last couple of days here on campus. Maybe that's causing some delays, some traffic delays, and I think some internet interruptions. So that may be what's to blame. But hopefully in the next few minutes, the rest of our panel is going to join us, and they'll be here in time for discussion and Q&A. And I just want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining, and remind you that that Q&A tab is going to be open throughout the duration. Joshua, is that going to be distracting for you if people add questions while you're talking? Okay, great. So feel free to add questions, comments in the Q&A section there. And we will have some time for discussion. Mr. Aiken has a lot of flexibility, he said in his presentation. So we're going to see how things go in terms of engagement and presentation, and we will have time maybe for some question and discussions at the end. Okay, for now, I'll turn it over to Robbie Madrigal, events coordinator in the library, for the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I'd just like to add my welcome to everyone who is joining us for this conversation today. We're really fortunate to have with us Mr. Joshua Aiken from Yale University. I'm going to do the land acknowledgement, and then I'll pass it back to Professor Murray. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Jeremy, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Robbie. I'll give a brief introduction of Joshua Aiken here, and then I'll turn the floor over to you, Josh. Joshua Aiken is a JD and PhD student in History and African American Studies at Yale University. He studies 19th and 20th century US history, race and migration in the Americas, mass criminalization, US empire, Black feminist thought, Black poetics, Black Marxism, and queer of color critiques. Mr. Aiken received his BA in American Cultural Studies and Political Science, summa cum laude from Washington University in St. Louis. He received his Master of Studies in US History with honors from the University of Oxford, and also a Master's of Science degree in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies, also from the University of Oxford. His research broadly focuses on the relationship between race and displacement and state-sanctioned violence in the 19th and 20th centuries, as configured by and through criminal, legal, and migration regimes. His work is focused both on race and gun laws in US history, using the framework of self-defense as a way of thinking about Black subjectivization and subjugation, and US imperial formations as they relate to extraterritorial migration policies since the 1980s, namely American sponsorship of Mexico's Plan Frontera Sur and other attempts to surveil and manage the movement of Central American refugees. Joshua is the former policy fellow at the Prison Policy Institute, and he is also a poet. I'm very excited for today's talk. Thank you so much, Joshua, for joining us. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to have a conversation about some of what I've been researching and studying, which in many ways has been part of a broader conversation that I know that the Race and Policing group has been having over the last few years. And so really excited to be with everyone today, and also to be in conversation with folks who are thinking about many of the dynamics that I'll discuss in my presentation. So what I'm going to do is go through a presentation talking about a specific case, that of Korryn Gaines, and use that as an entry point to think about policing, racial hierarchy, and the relationship between the law and our legal system, and how we understand social order and the status quo. Kind of really digging into some of the questions about what the role of the police has been, is meant to be, kind of what are those historical features, and what can it tell us today about what might come next, and really looking forward to conversation about all of this. I think that is the biggest piece of study and research for me, has always been digging into the questions even deeper with folks who are invested in creating real and meaningful change. And so I hope that today can be part of that. So I am going to share my screen and get started. Hopefully everyone can see that. And what I'm going to be discussing today is the case of Korryn Gaines. And this is going to take us back to 2016 in a moment of thinking about the relationship between gender, race, police violence, and armed self-defense. So what I'm going to go through are the facts of this case, the killing of Korryn Gaines, and many of the kind of the facts are based on some reporting that was done over the last several years by the Baltimore Sun. We're going to dig into the scene, kind of looking at the scenario of violation. What is the dynamic of a police-citizen encounter? Going to consider the juridical, and I'll kind of explain what I mean by that, but just briefly, just to kind of gesture towards it, thinking about the spaces in which the state decides whether something is good or bad, a behavior is good or bad, a person is good or bad, and recognizing that that happens when police officers search and arrest individuals, but it happens when a judge sentences someone. It happens when a child protective services officer makes a decision, and thinking about the variety of spaces where judgment is taking place as opposed to what we often think of as law enforcement. So kind of moving away from a neutral idea of thinking about law and order, and instead thinking about the judgment and the forms of social control that police officers, prisons, and our legal system are designed around. And then finally, thinking about proof and how one goes about demonstrating their truth or the evidence to back whatever claims they have. And this is especially pertinent in the case of Korryn Gaines. So I'm going to walk through the killing of this Black woman, Korryn Gaines, and injuring of her 5-year-old son by the Baltimore Police Department in 2016. And this portion of the talk is intended to document what happened. It is namely based, again, on Baltimore Sun reporting. And I place emphasis on that because one of the things that I want to trouble and question throughout this entire presentation is, how do we know what we know? A lot of what courts end up using in making decisions around the behavior of police officers are based on police testimony and police reports, official kind of documentation. And Korryn Gaines brings us to an interesting juncture of thinking about who is believed and whose experience and documentation actually gets admitted into adjudication, the decisions that are made by a court or a judge. So around 9:10 a.m. at the Randallstown apartment complex, Baltimore police officials served warrants for the arrest of both Korryn Gaines and her fiance. And when nobody at the apartment door let police officials in, they received a key from the rental office, but found that a chain lock still blocked their entry to the door. So an officer then kicks the door in, And officers say this is when Korryn Gaines pointed a shotgun at an officer, telling him to leave. Korryn's fiance left the apartment with the couple's 1-year-old daughter, while Gaines remained inside with her 5-year-old son. And at 9:41, the officials reported back to the police department officially a barricade situation. Korryn started to record audio and video on her phone and also began to post on social media, both Facebook and Instagram. And outside, police officials had obtained a warrant for arrest under new charges. So the original search warrant or the original warrant for Korryn Gaines specifically was a traffic violation. But once she pointed the gun at the officer who was attempting to enter the apartment, police officers were able to obtain a warrant related to these new charges, threatening a police official. And these new charges play a critical role in then determining what kinds of decisions and kind of principles are going to guide the behaviors of police officials. So it's ostensibly one thing to be coming to serve a warrant for someone's arrest related to a traffic violation from 2 months prior, but something else when what the police are there to do now is to respond to the threat of a shotgun, the threat of deadly force. So family members tried to reach Gaines by phone. They saw on Facebook and on Instagram that Gaines was capturing the kind of standoff, and at one point Gaines had her son Cody film an officer in the door to the apartment, and that's this photo here. And the officer at multiple points motioned for the boy to come out, but he stayed inside. At 1:41 p.m., Gaines is on the phone with police negotiators, and she explains that the traffic stop that led to her arrest involved mistreatment by the police, that she had been traumatized, that she had gone hours with no water during this police stop, and that it had led to the miscarriage of her twins. At 3:25, Gaines recorded a video in which she is holding a shotgun, she's shifting her weight, and her son is next to her. And what happens next is where the question as to what proof or what facts substantiate a case or substantiate an argument really comes to bear. So at 3:25, there is audio and video coming from Korryn's phone, going to Facebook and Instagram. But 45 minutes later, officers report back to the Baltimore police department that shots have been fired. And police noted during that call that it appeared that Korryn Gaines's Facebook and Instagram had been taken down. Now, the notion that it appeared that that these kind of social media accounts have been taken down is more or less a false pretense. Police officers had used what's known as a law enforcement portal in 2016. Facebook usually responded within the hour to any effort by law enforcement to use materials that were being disseminated or broadcast on social media for the purpose of ensuring the safety of individuals and also in the pursuit of solving crimes. And so those premises are what the Baltimore Police Department provided Facebook and Instagram. And the police asked the companies to deactivate the accounts. The companies complied, and we are left with 45 minutes passing, no audio or video, until we hear the sound of police officials saying that they fired 3 shots, they were shot back at, and that they have injured and entered the apartment and injured the assailant, the shooter, Korryn. And Korryn Gaines would die in her apartment that day from gunshot wounds. And her son, Cody, 5 years old, was wounded by shots that were fired by police officials. Officer Ruby Royce, who fired the shots, subsequently wrote that he fired his weapon after Gaines raised a gun in the direction of his fellow officers. He said he feared for their lives. He wrote that he fired again entering the apartment because Gaines had again raised her shotgun in his direction, and he feared both for his life and her son's life. After Ruby shot Gaines multiple times, a medic was called to the apartment. Gaines was pronounced dead, and her son Cody was taken to the hospital. But again, I want to underscore that once Officer Ruby Royce and the Baltimore Department had the reason of threat of a deadly weapon, threat of force, this provided a way for Officer Royce and other officers to evaluate the situation, not just taking stock of the original reason that they were there, the kind of original dynamics at play, which was a knock on the door that went unanswered. But now both Royce and the other officials are able to stake a claim to knowing what was in the child's best interest. Again, Cody was motioned by police officials to come out during the 6-hour standoff, and the child chose to stay with his mother. And again in the police reports, you hear that one of the reasons that the shots were fired when they were fired by police officials were in the interest of the safety of fellow officers and Korryn Gaines' son. And as we'll see, one of the dynamics of kind of the expansion of mass policing in the United States over the last 4 decades has been certain ideas of who can and who cannot control, manage, shape the behaviors of individuals. So ideas around social behavior have played an integral role. And so the idea that Korryn Gaines is not able to properly parent her child, and that is, in this moment, the reason that Officer Ruby Royce motions for the child to come out and then subsequently shoots his mother, I think is pertinent to understanding the dynamics that are at play. So this is a photo of the shotgun that Korryn had in Baltimore in 2016. Having this shotgun and using it for purposes of self-defense in one's home was perfectly legal. The Supreme Court just a number of years prior had established specifically that there was an individual right to have a weapon such as this for purposes of self-defense. And that dynamic of self-defense is altered slightly in the context of a citizen and a police official. But what I just want to emphasize is that the having of a weapon was not in and of itself a criminal activity. It was not something that on paper, in terms of the rights and the entitlements that individuals have in their homes, the presumption one would have is that there is a right for self-defense in one's home. So this is not to kind of explain the scenario as it unfolded over those 6 hours, but it's to situate how Korryn Gaines having a shotgun in her hand when the police are at the door fits into kind of broader understandings of why Americans have guns, why self-defense in the home is necessary. And this is a clip or photo of Korryn, and at the top you can see her son. He's just holding a cup of water a number of feet away from his mother, who has her hand on the trigger, both hands on the gun. And this is from a little bit before the Instagram and Facebook live streams were taken down. And again, we kind of experience about 45 minutes of silence before kind of the equivalent of police radio shows up, and we hear from police officials as to shots having been fired, and soon enough that a medic has been called and that Korryn Gaines is dead. So in this presentation, what I'm interested in talking about and having us discuss is all the ways that police officials are doing their work in alignment with broader projects of policing people. That those individuals who are wearing uniforms are not the only people who are engaged in the policing of social behavior, the policing of racial hierarchies, the policing of the settler empire that is the United States, but rather that policing is enmeshed in a broader order that we can see evolve historically. And what I'll focus on is the historical evolution that kind of booms in the 1980s and the 1990s, and is oftentimes narrated as the story of kind of the expansion of mass incarceration. But what I want to kind of hone in on is how it is a period of time where we see the expansion of a particular type of social control that involves policing people in all aspects of their lives, and that policing falling disproportionately on poor communities, marginalized communities, and communities of color, and even more specifically in particular ways on Black women. So what I'm going to discuss briefly is the notion of a scene and kind of why that is a way of capturing what is happening between Korryn and the police officers who have showed up to serve a warrant regarding a traffic violation. I'm going to talk about the juridical, again, cops, cages, and courts. And then finally return to kind of this idea of proof. And one of the things that I would just want to hone in on is the legal standard that the Supreme Court develops in the 80s and moving into the 90s that premises the idea of proof and reasonable behavior in response to proof or what one believes to be evidence of a potential crime, evidence of a crime, evidence of a threat, that the idea of what's reasonable in evaluating proof is dictated by the courts and shaped in such a way where a police's perspective, a police officer's point of view, the eye of the police is the presumed vantage point through which courts and through which the public should understand citizen and police interactions. That what's reasonable is what a police officer who, as the court has said, has been adequately trained, believes is reasonable to do in a given situation. So Korryn's mother, after her killing, was asked by the Baltimore Sun if she was surprised by what had happened. Korryn's mother was one of several family members who tried to get in touch with Korryn after seeing what was happening on social media. She knew about the traffic violations that Korryn had received, but really had the context of Korryn having had interactions with police officials in the criminal legal system that were in regard to very minor, low-level infractions that at other points in American history and in other countries would never be in the dominion of the police at all. So in this case, it's thinking about traffic violations that are not about immediate risk or safety. Korryn was pulled over for not having a license plate. She had a written message on a piece of cardboard that represented her license plate. And that was the traffic violation in question. And so her mother was asked if she was surprised by what happened. And she said she was very disappointed, but not surprised at all. And she points to the broader phenomena of this kind of police killing taking place. And she says, I don't care if you see it on video. They'll tell you your lying eyes isn't seeing what you're seeing. So I knew that it was going to be no different when they took away the eyes she had. They took away the eyes that she was giving to the world. And so I knew that the end result was going to be what it is today. And I want to underscore kind of one of the things that's being invoked here, which is video evidence as the way in which someone who otherwise may not be believed or may not be considered trustworthy, or the evidence may not be in their favor in terms of hearing their account of an experience, that there is a notion that video evidence, video proof, video documentation will provide the kind of credible evidence that will tell a different story of what happened or how things unfolded or who said what. And Korryn Gaines's mother is very clear kind of at the outset that regardless of whether you are able to capture some aspect of a series of events on video, in this case, they took the eyes that she had, her daughter had, and that the world had away. And they had control over the ability to see and the ability to have evidence put on the table that then could unfold as how we understand what happened. Again, that 45-minute period where Facebook and Instagram have taken down Korryn Gaines's streaming, and we lose eyes, we lose access to any other account or vantage point besides that of the police officials who are filing this both in live kind of in live action with the police department, informing them of kind of the shots that were fired, but then in a police report and in criminal proceedings or proceedings related to holding these officials accountable for use of force. That's where we get the other narratives and accounts of what happened. And so the idea of having Korryn's eyes and the eyes of the world taken away, I think, is paramount to understanding the way that what might seem like kind of veritable, concrete evidence and a way for us to have an entry point into what's happening or what has happened. I think what we can understand is there's something else going on here, that it's not just the idea of capturing something on tape, but rather how it's understood by whom, and if the kind of problem in the first place can be captured or contained by audio and video evidence. And I think Korryn Gaines, kind of the minute she starts recording, begs us to ask those kinds of questions. So I want to outline really quickly the scene that we're looking at, and I'm going to move somewhat quickly through kind of these points, but what I hope we can do is, if folks have questions, we can return to some of these following slides that are pointing at some of the kind of historical dynamics that are situating what Korryn Gaines is experiencing. And what I'd start with is the scenario itself, the scene, which is one of an armed American citizen at their home and armed police officers responding to someone having a weapon. And the starting dynamic here is that in the United States, there are more guns than people. The presumption is that all police officers in the United States carry at least a semi-automatic weapon because of how widespread gun ownership is in the United States. And the idea of having an individual right to bear arms is something that most Americans have understood colloquially as being part of the Second Amendment and part of the Constitution throughout American history. But in reality, it's only in 2008 that the Supreme Court names that there is an individual right to bear arms that is associated with traditionally lawful purposes, including, and Justice Scalia's specific, self-defense within the home. And one of the things that was kind of paramount in this ruling, DC versus Heller, and then the subsequent cases regarding gun rights in the United States, is that self-defense within the home consistently is what justices come back to as indicative of why an American would need to have a gun, why an American would need the right to bear arms. What happens if you can't rely on the state or the police to be there to protect you, kind of assuming that the scenario is one that is not involving the police as aggressors, and instead that an individual needs to have a gun for self-defense in case there is some other threat that they are under. But the entire scenario is shaped by an overwhelmingly armed society. I think that's an important starting place for understanding both Korryn Gaines's behavior and the dynamics of policing in the United States. This is an article from Essence magazine from a few days ago, which points towards Black women being the fastest growing group of gun owners in the United States. And this is happening especially over the pandemic. And researchers are pointing to a variety of reasons why, but one of them has to do with kind of the principle of why the individual right to bear arms has been kind of moved to the foreground by conservative jurisprudence over the last several decades. And it's this idea of individual self-defense being necessary in a violent society, and a society where you can't count on the protection of the state. And so while more often than not, when kind of conservative jurisprudence is invoking the Second Amendment and in this individual self-defense argument, it's the idea that a police officer wouldn't be able to get to a rural home quickly enough to respond to some incident or some transgression, and that's why there's a need for an individual right in the home. But for Black women and the timing of this fast-growing group of gun owners, what's reported is Black women having the experience of various types of violence and harm that they are made vulnerable to by the state and by inequities sponsored by the state historically. And I'll dive into that a little bit more. But the gist is that Black women, in being the fastest growing group of gun owners, is a reflection of a society where the presumption is that widespread gun ownership is going to be the status quo, and Black women's status is going to remain at the margins of social order enough such that Black women need to defend themselves across the board, and cannot rely on the state, cannot rely on other actors in the community, but rather that they need to own guns themselves to respond immediately to crises. And again, this entire conversation is taking place in the United States as an incredible outlier from the rest of the world in terms of the number of firearms that are in America and in the country, and especially the mass proliferation of cheap firearms, which we started to see especially in the 70s and the 80s. So the next piece that I want to briefly point to is thinking about the dynamic of spectacle or scene, and just naming the long history of violence against Black people being something that has to be seen to be believed, and also violence against Black people being part of spectacle or show, something to be seen and entertained by. And Amy Louise Wood, in her book Lynching and Spectacle, discusses the entire industry of lynching postcards, and the idea of communities, not just in the South, but throughout the United States, especially moving into the early 20th century, the Midwest, communities where a white member of a community would send a postcard to a relative that would have on one side the most recent lynching in that community's town, the townspeople there for functionally a show and then a picnic, and a postcard being sent to a relative to just let them know what's going on in your local community. And so lynching operating as a spectacle, but operating as also a kind of a clue that this community was taking justice into its own hands, right? Is the rationalization that kind of was behind lynchings consistently, was this need for the everyday citizens to hold people to account for transgressions, and lynchings in actuality were tools of political terror used to marginalize Black communities, and especially Black laborers who are entering the job market, right? So whether it's thinking about work by Estelle Friedman or Crystal Feimster, there's a lot of scholarship just pointing towards lynchings as a tool for repression, and what it means for them to be a spectacle or to be an image to be distributed and sent about, and what that might mean for how we now see injuries against Black people, violence against Black people, and our need or desire to see video or visual proof before we know something is true. And what this amounts to is a historically informed way of understanding who experiences pain and violence how. And these are just two studies that are pointing to kind of the recent research that is coming out regarding implicit bias in the medical profession. And these studies focus not just on doctors, but they also look, not just on medical students, but they also look at folks from a variety of professions, and consistently find that there are differing ideas about Black and white people's ability to withstand pain. That across racial groups, there are some variations in terms of kind of how a lay person might understand or interpret someone describing their symptoms, or understand kind of the scale or the magnitude of someone's pain based on their race. But what these studies kind of point to is the material consequences of that. Black people being prescribed pain medication less, first and second year medical students thinking that Black people have thicker skin, both in the way that it's framed in the study, both kind of in a actual physical and metaphorical way, where Black people are able to just withstand more harm. And ideas around danger, harm, who poses a threat, are all interrelated with these ideas about who can and does withstand injury. And our reason, again, for needing to see proof, needing to see images to know that something took place. And so in thinking about the idea of a scene, my work and my research is very much informed by Black studies and the work of Saidiya Hartman and her kind of path-breaking work in scenes of subjection. And the book starts, and this is a quote from it, and I'll just kind of point to the line of the ease with which such scenes are usually reiterated the casualness with which they are circulated, and the consequences of this routine display. And Hartman here is talking about the display of violence against enslaved people, and what that meant for how people understood Black people's existence, not just in enslavement, but also in freedom. That the casual mention, the casual representation, the casual discussion of violence against Black people, in many ways, not just numbing us to forms of violence and pain, but actually creating a script and a narrative where we, in certain scenarios or certain settings, anticipate or expect or normalize the idea that there is going to be Black injury involved in some type of transgression, some type of altercation, something that might be kind of on paper seem like a kind of simple interaction between two individuals, if no race or gender or age is mentioned, how respondent might respond to kind of hearing about that interaction, versus hearing that the interaction is between a Black person and a white person, a police officer and a Black woman, kind of being given cues that are informed by the dissemination of images that kind of give us a script of what happens to whom, where, and why, and that there become these scenes and scenarios of violation that I think Korryn Gaines's case really speaks to. So I'm going to move really quickly to just talk about a little bit more of the historical dynamic of kind of what is informing the kind of relationship between policing and Black women's status in American social order, and what it can tell us about the role of police more broadly. And one of the ways to think about this is in the 1980s. Again, this is when we start to see, if you've read The New Jim Crow, this is when the conversation kind of starts around the building of mass incarceration. This is when there is a lot of talk of the militarization of police forces. And those things are empirically shown to be true. That is part of what's happening in the 80s, in the 90s, in response to varied crime rates, especially in large cities. But at the same time, you have other narratives taking place that are blaming particular people for certain behaviors. And so 2 examples of how this is mapping onto Black mothers and Black women more broadly are the notions of welfare queens and then what Joy James has called the captive maternal. And in both of these cases, the main point I want to make, and again, we can return to this, is that the way that the welfare system developed in the in the 80s and the 90s, and the way that motherhood has continued to be policed and managed through reproductive rights, through access to contraceptives, to access to family planning, that throughout the 80s and the 90s, one of the primary discourses that surrounded Black women and Black communities was the failure of Black mothers to mother appropriately, to raise children right, the failure of Black communities to engage in proper behaviors. And so the 80s and the 90s become this period of time where mass policing becomes a response to very low level interactions and altercations, but it's all premised on the idea of stopping small behaviors that are showing up in poor communities of color, and using police as a way to respond to these smaller, sometimes not even criminal deviant behaviors, and using those as a way to prevent actual crimes from taking place. And there's a lot of research to show that this has not been effective, and there was evidence at the time that it wasn't going to be effective. But one of the dynamics of that argument was the idea that it was the social behavior and the patterns of social behavior of poor folks, especially poor folks of color, that were the root cause of the problem, the root cause of crime and violence, and that a failure of mothering played an integral role in that social behavior and how it developed. And so this is the last piece that I want to hone in on, which is the juridical, which is this idea of cops, cages, and courts. And I want to talk about this because the way that we end up talking about the police is through a framework that has been provided by the police. A framework that describes police officers as being tasked with law enforcement. When another way of understanding what is happening when one comes up against a criminal law, one comes up against a tax form, is that one is interacting with the state in spaces of judgment, where the state has a role to play in deciding whether something is appropriate or not, is in the interest of the public good or not. And a judgment is made, one that has a moral conviction behind it, that then justifies whatever decisions or outcomes arise. And so thinking about the juridical takes us into a space where we can place what police officers are doing alongside the various other ways that, especially in the 80s and the 90s, the state began to police all sorts of people, not just those who ended up immediately in handcuffs in the kind of custody of a armed officer. And so the 80s and the 90s end up being this time of the creation of courts. And many of us may be now familiar with kind of the various ways that one can interact with the court system, but we don't always name it as such. We don't always understand it as being the same thing as what police officers are doing when they are getting a search warrant from a judge and then executing said warrant, right? A judgment being made on the risk or the suspicion of a person, and a judgment being made and an action being carried out following that. Well, the 80s and the 90s see this taking place in a huge variety of contexts of people's lives that touch on areas that we often don't think of as where policing is taking place, but are areas where the social behaviors of people are regulated, managed, and controlled, and that judgment is taking place in those domains that places the blame and kind of the culpability on those communities. So these in the 90s see the expansion of substance use courts, mental health courts, courts that are talking about child protective services or child dependency, motor vehicle violations, misdemeanor courts, a variety of spaces where the kind of title of court is applied, and it is done so for the purpose of clarifying that there is state power behind the decision that's going to be made as to whether someone is an adequate parent, or as to whether someone is able to leave a treatment facility for a substance use disorder. And the language of court hides the punishment and the control that is inherent in the dynamic of the state passing judgment on one's behaviors or one's person. And what becomes especially paramount here is to think about, in the case of Korryn Gaines, that we start this entire interaction with a traffic violation. If one thinks about Ferguson and Michael Brown, the municipality of Ferguson was functionally being kept afloat by minor fines and fees associated with traffic violations, associated with petty crimes, if that. you see these variety of spaces where judgment and social control are taking place, but it's not an armed officer necessarily who is doing the legwork, but rather a judge in a robe or an administrative official or someone with child protective services deciding that a child should be taken out of a home because there is no food in the refrigerator, and there's no food in the refrigerator because that family has been denied welfare benefits because of not being able to show that they've previously been able to provide adequate parenting, right? These kind of cycles that in the 80s and the 90s out of welfare reform traps people in one one social behavior being punished for another, and then being linked to each other in ways that trap people in systems of being incarcerated, being engaged with police officials, or interacting with the law in courtrooms all the time. So very quickly, I want to mention the dynamics of proof one more time, just to bring us back to the point I was making a little bit earlier about reasonableness, and that the perspective of police officials is a starting place for us to understand proof. And so after Korryn Gaines was killed, very quickly local officials said that they were going to expedite a program for body cameras on all police officials in the local community. And that was going to be one of the ways that the police department responded to this tragedy. And what I want to call attention to is the question of what a body camera could prove. In the 80s and the 90s, one of the things that happens is that the Supreme Court creates standards and norms, both around the use of force and just the kind of amount of suspicion that's needed for someone to be pulled over, or someone to be stopped and frisked. And consistently, reasonableness is defined through the eyes of what an officer believed to be true at a given time. And the research that has been coming out over recent years has shown that body cameras in and of themselves have not provided statistically significant effects on most of the interactions of officers and citizen behaviors. And what I want to emphasize here is that it is not a question of whether body cameras work or not, but it's a question of whether there is a way for body cameras to provide a mode of accountability through the norms and through the standards of your legal system that would allow whatever footage exists to actually mean anything. Because if the standard is so bound up in what is perceived or believed to be true from the perspective of a law enforcement officer, then the video footage is going to provide a judge or a jury with very little if the instruction that they're given is to look at the situation from the perspective of what a police officer believed at the time. And so I suggest that that is one of the ways we should think about the juridical, is thinking about how courts have shaped how a jury, how a judge is going to look at the actions of a police official when they use force, when they are responding to a situation like that of Korryn Gaines. One of the things that I will just kind of end with is that Korryn Gaines's case calls attention to one of the ways that the narratives that have surrounded policing and surrounded mass incarceration, kind of starting in the 80s and 90s, has foregrounded the kind of formal criminal ways that folks get swept up into the net of state surveillance and state control. And so whether it's low-level drug offenses, whether it's three strikes laws, there's a lot of emphasis on the ways that the police and the carceral system have impacted communities of color, especially men of color, young Black men. And that has been incredibly important for us to understand some of how and why the police are playing a role in the control of social behavior, such they are. But another historical dynamic that a variety of scholars have been calling attention to, and you can go from kind of Sarah Haley's work, going back to the early 20th century, you can look at some of the work of Miriam Kaba, kind of calling attention to the kind of organizing that survivors of various forms of violence who are thinking through what kind of the growth of policing and criminalization and punishment has meant over the last several decades. And the perspective of women of color, and specifically Black women, tells us something else. And these are two kind of statistics from a really important report from, and I'll name my former employer, the Prison Policy Initiative, that shows that there are some specific ways that the last several decades, policing and the carceral system have impacted women and have impacted Black women specifically ideas around the threat or danger of Black women and what they are, what they do, how they're perceived. All of those dynamics are showing up in how the police are actually responding and interacting with folks. And the research found that Black women were about 17% more likely in a police-initiated traffic stop to have a traffic stop than white women. And this disparity is greater than the disparity between Black men and other men. And so I just want to emphasize the way that Korryn Gaines's case starts with a traffic stop. Traffic courts are one of an array of various courts that sweep people into the surveillance of the state, whether it's Child Protective Services, whether it's qualifying for welfare, for TANF, whether it's something related to substance use or mental illness. All these various ways where courts end up playing a role in deciding how social behavior should be controlled and regulated, they have race, class, and gender dynamics that we have to pay attention to. And if we pay attention to those, we start to have to think about other ways of understanding what the police do, what they're there to serve, and what safety means for everyone and robustly in our communities, and what it means if we kind of continue to have a narrow view or perspective of the kinds of injury and harm and the kinds of policing that are taking place that dismisses or downgrades or downplays the various ways that the state, through armed officers, but just as much through the court system, just as much through turning people through jails and prisons, ensnares people in a system of social control and punishment that involves judgment at the end of the day. The state saying that you and your behaviors are right and wrong, and in the case of Korryn Gaines, that you and your behaviors are wrong. And as such, we feel entitled to use lethal force against you, and then have part of the justification for doing so be that we were acting in the safety, in the interest and in the safety of your child. That us as the state, the police officers standing outside your door, having just broken the door in, have a better insight into how to care for a child than the child's mother. And that this is the kind of insight that we can get if we pay attention to the various ways that the juridical, not just kind of the armed cop, but all the sites where the state provides judgment and kind of consequences, we pay attention to the ways that it affects different communities disproportionately. So I am gonna end there. And I see we have a little bit of time for questions, but thank you all so much. And please, if you're not able to ask your question right now, send me an email. I'm happy to talk about any and all of this much more.
Thank you, Joshua. We haven't met. My name is Mary Texera, and I used to teach in the sociology department here. And I want to thank you because we have not had enough conversations and have not looked at the treatment of African American and women of color in the criminal justice system. So I think your research is going a long way in helping us with that. I mean, not until Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland, the high profile cases, did we even understand that African American women were treated as badly as we have seen in the last few years. And it looks like we have some questions, and Stan is going to lead us on those questions. However, Stan, I'm always the first to ask a question, even though I don't raise my hand or put it in the Q&A. But we have a lot of young people listening and joining in this conversation today, Joshua, and many of them are making up their minds about careers and so forth. And so if you could do us and them a favor in talking about your trajectory from, let's say, a second grader, you don't have to go all the way back if you don't want to, but all the way back to school and then where you are now. Could you tell us a little bit about the decisions you made that got you where you are right now?
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. And I think that one of the things that I would kind of suggest in what I presented and kind of pointing to statistics and data and graphs and kind of the various forms of evidence that we can provide when we're making claims, that those are really, really important. And also that our lived experiences are very important and our own expertise, right? And so for me, it has been the experience of giving myself space and time to understand what it has been to be a Black queer person in the world. I came to this project on guns because of losing multiple family members to gun violence and losing family members to mass incarceration, with sentences drastically increased by firearm sentencing enhancements. So those experiences, I think, really have informed the classes that I ended up taking, the groups that I got involved in. But I think the two other things that I would add to that, kind of your personal experience being one of them, is that I found spaces where folks were willing to be generous and patient as I learned about all of this. The way that I think about policing, the way that I think about prisons is very, very different than me in high school or as a college freshman. It's just the very different views. And it took some folks being patient with me and talking through some of the assumptions that I was making about why certain people did certain things, why kind of the world was the way it was. And there are some folks who I think of all the time who really were patient with me and gave me the space to think and learn and come into my own understanding of how systems operated, how inequality came to be. And I'm always grateful for those folks. And so I think for me, it's always also important to name that the kind of analysis and perspective that I have now is was not given. It is something that has been built in community and has been built learning from folks. And And then the one other piece that I will say is not only have people really over time poured into me, but it's been the experience of pouring into community that has been really important for me in figuring out what I wanted to study and figuring out what it meant to do policy work. I went to the Prison Policy Initiative because one of the things that I think is incredible about what they do is all of those charts, all of the reports they publish, the goal is for folks to take those charts and go to their local city council meeting and say, hey, our jail has 600 empty beds and has for the last 20 years. What's going on with that? Why are we giving more money to the correctional officials in our city or our state? Empowering people with the information, and that is coming in community. That's showing up at school board meetings. That's showing up at city council meetings, and that has been a space where I feel like I have come into my own politics, come into my kind of passion for research that actually shows up in people's lives. Because Robin D.G. Kelly said a couple of weeks ago that we don't critique and kind of provide this analysis for fun or to be mean or tear people down or say that other people are wrong. We critique because our lives depend on getting the answers right.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That is just so profound, and it's true. It's not just an academic exercise for many of us. And I'm so glad you talked about your metamorphosis, I guess, because many people assume the kind of work that we all do, especially African Americans in academia, that we were raised by these radical Black Panthers and that, you know, we came in with our berets and our Black power signs, and it's not the case at all, because I was very much like you. I'm a former police officer, and I was definitely not on the side of police when I came into academia, but I wasn't against police either. You know, I wasn't critical of the whole process. So it's so interesting to hear you underscore the your change and how that happened with the patience and kindness of others dragging you along, sort of. So I'm so glad that that you said that, and I hope our young students they take some inspiration, I guess, from you, because many of them come from, you know, sort of conservative homes, and if not economically conservative, certainly socially conservative homes. And so I think this is very, very valuable. We do have, I think there's one person who is actually asking a lot of questions. Am I right, Stan?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so let's hear them.
I just want to say, my name is Stan Futch. I'm glad to meet you, Dr. Aiken, and very interesting story. I like the way you told it, because you also told the story, but you gave a lot of history, and that's what I really enjoy, the history of the African Americans' plight in the United States, and it goes on. Thank you. And here's one of the questions. In 1990, as chairman of a large county in California mental health board, the board realized that there was violence by police on clients. The board recommended then to have de-escalation training for police officers. Joshua, instead of police, it is at schools where appropriate responses to inappropriate behavior in schools is not addressed. Note that the 488-900 has been changed.
Can you give us that? Did you understand that, Joshua?
I mean, I think so. And
okay, sorry then. I didn't. That's my
well, I mean, I think what is and kind of looking at the other questions that kind of is putting forward is asking, I think, like a really important question as to if we're saying that we don't think the police should be playing the role of shaping social behaviors, how does it happen? Where, like, if people are doing bad things, how do we respond if we don't have police, right? Kind of this assumption that police are the solution to all social problems, that we should defer to the legal system and policing as a solution. And so in the kind of example given of this mental health board, I mean, I think it's really important for the conversations that we're having today around policing that the numbers of folks who are living and not receiving the appropriate amount of care and support around mental illness, and the amount of care and support around substance use disorders, that we, I think, as a country, very rarely kind of actually face kind of how vast that challenge and problem is. And one of the ways that we avoid it is we police it, right? We police very small crimes that are related to a set of other problems that folks are facing, and we use cages and handcuffs as a response. And so I think the example of kind of giving de-escalation trainings to police officers is important in that I think the impulse there is that we need folks in communities who are able to de-escalate conflicts. I think that's very, very much true. But I think what we have to challenge and have to think through is why we are deferring to policing as the answer to that. And policing being the power of the state, the power of the courts, the power of the entity that can take your home if they want to, right? I mean, kind of that all the might is there associated with that one officer. And if that's who's responding to your mental health crisis, you're gonna react in a very different way. And so I think the impulse of kind of de-escalation and the impulse of what are kind of our alternatives or other ways of shaping social behaviors and responding to them, I think is a really important one. And I think the biggest thing is that we owe it to ourselves to imagine something that actually gets at kind of supporting folks and meeting them where they are and where their communities need them to be.
Thank you. Thank you. He has another question, and the question is, in the story you told, and I like the fact that you didn't do this, he wants to know what would your solution to the whole process of avoiding her death?
Yeah, I mean, I think that plain and simple, do not believe that police officers should have been at Korryn Gaines's door that day. I think that it is unfathomable if we kind of like strip away kind of all the norms we have around policing and kind of how pervasive kind of they are in American life, that the idea that the proper response to a traffic violation, not from this morning or from yesterday, but from weeks ago, is to show up at somebody's house and not communicate or make clear kind of the terms of what's going on. I think showing up in the first place is not the right solution. And even more so that it's police officers showing up to kind of to serve a warrant. And so I think just the starting place is that I don't think that if we're concerned about motor vehicle safety, that the answer to that is having police officers show up at someone's house. I think we have lots of other ways to think about what it looks like to keep people safe on the road. I think we have a lot of other ways to think about how we can have the state interact with people that doesn't involve kind of the immediate threat of somebody knocking on your door. Again, the Supreme Court, when creating all of the recent Second Amendment jurisprudence, kind of is always thinking about the idea of, oh, if a stranger knocks at your door, you should have the right to defend yourself, right? So it's something that we've kind of got baked into how we think about the rights and entitlements people should have. And that's not to say that I endorse kind of the conservative perspective on that, meaning we should have more guns than people in the country. But I say that to underscore a traffic violation shouldn't get us here in the first place. Again, we owe it to ourselves to have better solutions to social problems than that.
Thank you. And this goes on to that, and it says, we have the right to bear arms, but it says here, it seems encountering the police at home and an individual having a gun doesn't result in a peaceful resolution. And I know being Black and all of these cases you've seen lately, it's Black folks that don't end up in a peaceful situation. And of course, I haven't seen any stories about whites on the news, and I don't know if they're having the same issue that Black folks are having.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important thing to talk about, because I think that one of the aspects of thinking about kind of solutions to social problems is thinking about, okay, what's people's reality, and then what ideas or concepts are interacting with it. So for example, I think for lots of Black folks, they are in spaces or contexts of disadvantage where it feels like having a gun will make them safer, will make their family safer, is the safer way to interact with a white supremacist society where more and more kind of vigilante terror is just kind of part of everyday American life. I never want to downplay or dismiss that is something that people really experience, and that's real fear. And I also think that it's really important that we talk about the history of the Second Amendment and the history of the proponents of gun rights. Because even in that 2008 case, Heller, that case was originally named after a Black woman in DC. And conservatives had sought her out. This was a woman who had her home broken into twice. And they wanted to have a Black woman at the fore saying, I need to have a gun to keep me and my family safe in DC. And that's why the Supreme Court should expand gun rights. Now, those exact same lawyers, those exact same politicians who are advocating for gun rights are the same politicians that are defunding schools, are the same politicians who are gutting the social safety net more broadly. These are folks who are not interested in bettering the lives of poor people and people of color. But they are interested in expanding the rule that allows them to use guns however they see fit. And then the consequences, exactly as you said, Stan, the consequences end up falling on Black folks. And so it's I think a really challenging dynamic, because I think it's trying to respond to a real need and a real fear. And the need is a need for safety. And then trying to develop solutions that don't rely on things that create more harm. And that involves real political organizing and mobilizing. And that's a taller order than someone just being able to go down the block to the pawn shop and pick up someone's semi-automatic they got rid of.
I don't know how much time you have. Mary, you have a question?
Well, I think it's more a comment and maybe get your opinion. When you gave the statistics, or you gave the outcome of body cams, since we have time now, since they've been deployed, I just think there's more to it than that, because police officers play hard and dirty with body cameras. You know, it went out, or I lost it, it fell off, or whatever. And I just read in the paper the other day where they're now standing in front of their partner's body cam, so that you don't see the entire story. So I don't know about you, but I'd rather have them than not. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's important is that we think about why so quickly police departments have been willing to get on board with getting body cams. Because I think the kind of premise and the technology, both kind of on both fronts, they move in the direction of more accountability, right?
Yeah.
They provide another vantage point in. And exactly as Korryn Gaines's mom said, you know, it's giving the world a set of eyes. And if the police are there for public safety and it's a public interest, we should want those things. And what I think is the bigger question is all these police forces that are getting body cameras. Okay, how often are they turning them off? Are there certain periods of the time? Are they on certain shifts when they're with certain other officers? Like really, really parsing out whether getting tools for accountability actually is going to amount to accountability. And then it should tell us something about the leadership, right? It should tell us something about the police chief that is doing the press conference about getting body cameras in 2019, but is doing absolutely nothing about officers standing in front of officers. And I'm glad that was a story in the news, because I think that's kind of what we need is looking at the proposed reforms and seeing what about them is getting at the core of the issue, right? And kind of focusing on that, which is accountability for, like what the state is able to do to the public in the public's name, the public's good. And thinking about solutions that are focused on that, and then evaluating the solutions that were given. And I think with body cameras, it's kind of this, I think of it as a lot of police departments telling on themselves that their officers are turning off their cameras so often, or standing in front of each other, or, oh, I just happened to not have my camera that day. I mean, I think if those are the kinds of things that are happening in what a department is branding as a move towards accountability, then it seems much more likely that the interest is not in accountability, it's in getting less press coverage, or less folks at the city council meeting angry and frustrated about having a police force that's not actually accountable to the people.
And why would we want our camera on when we turned off her social media?
Yes,
We
exactly.
don't want our camera showing what her camera was showing. And so, yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
We don't want to keep you too long, so I just want to say there was a lot of stuff you brought up, and I haven't had a chance to ask my question. And one of the things was, while the incident's going on, they obtained an additional warrant for the current crimes, and that's not just with her. If you look at incidents when they pull over someone because they have a license plate light out, and they pull them over, and they get to their window, and then all of a sudden they smell marijuana, and then all of a sudden they back away and hold the guy there until they get a warrant to search his car, and go on and on and on and on, and it just grows. I did learn a new word, jurisdictional. What's your word? Jurisdictional?
Oh, juridical.
Juridical. I like that. And I'll use it. And that's what it's all about. We start at A and we end at Z, and the poor brother ain't got a chance. Because it's grown from, like you said, a traffic light to he's in jail for 20 years.
Well, I mean, most of these incidents that we've seen through the years, what was George Floyd killed over? Kiting a $20 bill. Sandra Bland, traffic stop. On and on and on and on and on. There was no armed robberies involved in these police killings. It's the small things that give officers an excuse. And I do believe, and I'm very careful in using that term, giving them an excuse to use deadly force against people in communities. And so it's not like television, where officers get in shootouts and somebody dies. It is not. It is just everyday, ordinary things that we do all day long. And for people to say, well, you should have done what the officer told you to do, because that's what, one of the, George Floyd's critiques was, well, he was defiant. He was in a police car and they took him out of the police car, I mean, it becomes farce in some ways because of, but farce is funny, and this is really not funny. This is costing lives. So Joshua, thank you so much for joining us today. We have kept you way, way, way too long, but we wish you luck in your career. You will probably hear from us again.
There you go. That's right. You'll hear from us again.
And if there are any of your colleagues who would like to, maybe has a certain niche that they would like to talk about in this particular forum, please pass on our information to them. We would appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us. And for the students that had questions that didn't get answered, we will get a hold of you and answer your questions. Thank you.
We're sorry. Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you all so much, and really appreciate you all creating the space. So
you are quite welcome, and good luck. Good luck. See you.
Thanks so much.